In 1876, the Republican Party was looking for someone to counter the corrupt image of the scandal-ridden Grant years. Affable and morally scrupulous, Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes was the perfect anti-Grant.
His personality was why he got the nomination, partly. Hayes promised to be a different type of president who would make his own decisions, appoint people on the basis of merit rather than to pay back a favor.
One observer at the time called him a third-rate nonentity whose only recommendation is that he is obnoxious to no one. Hayes was lucky even to be alive to run for president in 1876. His stint in the Civil War nearly killed him. He was wounded 5 times and had 4 horses shot out from under him. Some would later call the election of 1876 between Hayes and New York Governor Samuel Tilden the last battle of the Civil War. Once again, Hayes barely emerged intact. It was a bitter, hard-fought campaign, and on election night it looked as if Tilden had won.
Hayes went to bed assuming he had lost because Tilden was something like 260,000 votes ahead, which in modern figures was about 1.3 million.
Like George W. Bush in 2000, Hayes lost the popular vote. The tally in the Electoral College also seemed to favor Tilden, but it was close. And as in the 2000 election, results from several states were in dispute. Awaiting the outcome of the election at his estate in Ohio, Hayes was telling the local papers that he had lost.
Finally, they got word to him, quit saying you'd lost the election because we're gonna win it.
After 4 months of accusations, negotiations, and recounts, both sides finally agreed to allow a specially appointed electoral commission to settle the matter. Voting 8-7 along party lines, the commission gave all 3 disputed states and the election to Rutherford B. Hayes. The last hurdle blocking Hayes's path to the White House was confirmation by the House of Representatives. Democrats threatened to filibuster, but their opposition evaporated. Historians would later speculate of a so-called Great Compromise in which Hayes made concessions in exchange for the presidency. While it seems likely that a backroom deal was made, it's not clear what was promised. For Hayes, this was a precarious way to begin a presidency. His detractors saddled him with unflattering nicknames.
He was called his fraudulency.
Or the Great Usurper.
Rutherford Hayes.
Not exactly the moniker you want to carry into your administration.
On March 3rd, 1877, Hayes was sworn in the White House Red Room, the first president to take the oath of office inside the executive mansion.
Hayes took his public oath of office 2 days later on the steps of the Capitol.
Number 19, Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican, 1877 to 1881, 54 years old, from Ohio. Hayes was the first president to have a telephone installed in the White House. He and his wife Lucy are also credited with filling in some crucial gaps in the White House portrait collection by commissioning paintings of former Presidents Jefferson, Adams, and Jackson. Hayes was a Harvard Law School graduate with a sunny disposition and a reputation for honesty.
Hayes definitely was one of these people who came into office and just was crushed to realize the pettiness and the absurdity and the day in and day out dealing with human foibles, office seekers, grievances.
The Hayes White House was subdued. Lucy Hayes believed in temperance.
She was called Lemonade Lucy because she banned liquor from the White House. And Hayes wasn't so strong on that, but he went along with his wife.
The joke was that at state functions in the White House, water flowed like wine.
President Hayes showed temperance in his management style as well.
He approached everything from kind of a scholarly, legalistic approach. His style of leadership was to gather the information, consult the proper advisors, make a decision. Once a decision is made, try not to look back and be decisive.
When Hayes took office, the country was still dealing with the legacy of post-Civil War Reconstruction. Federal troops were stationed in the state houses of South Carolina and Louisiana to protect black-supported Republican governments from takeover by the Democrats, who were mostly ex-Confederates. In the most controversial act of Hayes's presidency, he ordered the removal of the troops from the state houses, clearing the way for Democratic takeover of the last two southern states still under Republican rule.
It was the symbolic end of Reconstruction.
Some historians see this as a consummation of the backroom deal made during the disputed election. In the so-called Great Compromise, Republicans allegedly agreed to give up control of the South if the Democrats would rescind their opposition to Hayes becoming president.
Basically, you've got to exchange Republican control of the White House in exchange for Democratic control of the state governments of now the entire South.
Hayes has been vilified for his complicity in the deal, agreeing to end Reconstruction in exchange for the presidency. But historians point out that the Great Compromise of 1877 isn't exactly what it appears.
The election of Hayes is taken very often as the ending of Reconstruction, but Hayes represented the faction of the Republican Party which wanted to end Reconstruction. And his nomination shows that the Republican Party was already retreating from further intervention in the South to protect the rights of black people. So the bargain or the compromise of 1877, which finally puts Hayes in the White House and is sort of the point at which Reconstruction ends, is an important moment, but it's also the culmination of a trajectory which has taken place for several years before that.
Hayes was already interested in a new approach to the South. He was convinced that the return of civilian rule would bring with it a return of civility.
Hayes believed that if what was often called the best men, the better sort, the well-to-do Southern whites came back into power, even as Democrats, that they would, in a sort of paternalistic way, protect blacks from violence and recognize their basic rights.
He was shocked when that didn't happen.
This was probably the biggest disappointment to Rutherford Hayes because he really felt betrayed by the former Confederate leaders because they were supposed to be officers and gentlemen.
Regardless of how the decision had been made, under Hayes's watch, the window closed on Reconstruction, dooming blacks in the South to years of segregation and deprivation, and keeping the old Confederacy a white man's country for another 100 years. For better or worse, the great issues of the age had been settled, and as the Civil War faded into memory, the reformers in Hayes's party were in search of another defining issue.
Some people thought that civil service reform would be as important as anti-slavery had been. I have never quite understood that.
The civil service meant government jobs, like postal officials and tax collectors. These positions were used by politicians to exert influence and extort cash.
There's no income tax. One of the largest ways of the federal government to collect taxes was on customs duties. And most of U.S. imports and exports came through or went out of the Port of New York. So the collector of the Port of New York was a really significant position in the federal bureaucracy at this time.
The New York Custom House was the biggest source of patronage in the country, and consequently it tended to be quite corrupt.
Appointments to the Custom House, including the position of chief collector, were controlled by New York's corrupt political machine, namely the so-called Republican stalwarts led by Senator Roscoe Conkling. In one of the few decisive moments of his presidency, Hayes removed the head of the Custom House, who was a Conkling crony, and replaced him with someone of merit. But the deposed crony would not have long to lick his wounds. His name? Chester A. Arthur, who, against all odds, would become president himself within 3 years. In the final year of his presidency, Hayes became the first sitting president to travel to the West Coast, a move he hoped would bring unity to the country. Despite some calls for him to run again, he honored a campaign pledge not to seek a second term.
He said no, he had enough. He really didn't like the presidency very much.
In his typical positive way, Hayes was quite proud of the accomplishments of his administration.
He thought he was the best president since John Quincy Adams, with the exception of Lincoln.
Hayes retired to his home in Fremont, Ohio, where he spent the last years of his life working tirelessly for education reform and civil rights for black Americans. In doing so, he set a standard for future ex-presidents. 3 different presidents occupied the White House in 1881. Rutherford Hayes, James Garfield, and Chester Arthur.